Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Adam Lang. There's never been a greater focus on culture at work than there is now. A series of very high-profile problems keep reminding us that we have a long way to go. Last year, Executive Bo Pahari was appointed head of AMP Capital and then forced to step down within 2 months over pre-existing allegations about his behaviour to a female staff member. Not long after that, QBE Chief Executive Pat Regan left the insurer after an investigation into his messages to a female employee. The texts and emails were deemed not to be sexual harassment, but were still considered inappropriate, particularly by the recipient. And more recently, the culture of Parliament House itself has been called into question following rape allegations, as well as images and accounts of lewd behaviour by male staffers. Earlier this month, the federal government announced it would reform laws around sexual assault and harassment at work, declaring it would adopt 55 recommendations from the Respect at Work report. This is only one part of workplace culture, but it's one that has the potential to cause enormous damage if you get it wrong. Deborah Coram is the Chief Executive Officer of Safetrac, Australia's leading compliance platform. Deborah, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
First, can you take me through what Safetrac does?
Certainly. Safetrac is primarily a compliance training platform which enables corporations to train thousands of staff on a variety of topics that relate to compliance type issues. There's sort of a large degree of functionality with that platform that also allows you to test and monitor knowledge and behaviours. And we're sort of seeing we've been around for around 20 years now. Over the last 5 years, we have grown exponentially. And that's really, I guess, reflective of the emphasis and the growth that we're seeing for corporations placing more emphasis on compliance.
So broadly, how would you rate the culture in most Australian companies?
Yeah, I would categorise the culture within companies we see across Australia into 3 broad categories. I'd say ones that those who have a staff-first approach, ones that have a tick-a-box approach, and those for whom culture is an afterthought. It's unsurprising to learn that those with a staff-first approach value culture as part of their core. We see these companies with leaders at the top promoting policies, procedures and practices which are passed down to the management who then ensure that culture infiltrates down to the core staff of the organisation. And those businesses tend to focus on culture, also tend to focus on compliance and view compliance-related activities as a guide to helping ensure they're maintaining and building a safe and healthy workplace and have workplace practices that help build what we like to call long-term shareholder value. They focus on that and invest heavily in excellent systems, processes, people and training. They don't worry about spending money on those things. They think that's a necessary investment. Then we move to the second group of companies, which I like to view as this sort of check-a-box approach. And they tend to approach culture and compliance as a thing they have to do in order to be compliant with the law. They're doing it because they have to, not because they want to. And we typically see leaders in these businesses be focused more on their short-term shareholder value. We're trying to maximise profits, so we minimise our spend on things that may be expensive to do well, but can really focus on changing behaviours. And they have a fairly rudimentary approach to doing the minimum, and we see them invest only in systems with an effort to helping them check a box and avoid liability in the case where they may be found to have breached some law. But we're really seeing that checking the box approach is not enough to change behaviours in organisations. And we're often seeing these type of organisations, large organisations, on the front page of the paper for all the wrong reasons. And you mentioned a couple of companies in your introduction. You could say that all of them probably had compliance systems in place, but I can assure you they were probably done to check a box, not because the leaders were really behind those systems. And then the third group of companies we see is, of course, the worst, where compliance is an afterthought. We are rapidly seeing these companies shrink in number, though, because the reality is these days you will not be in business very long if you are not running a compliant business. I think probably the change in direct liability of officers under various legislative codes has helped drive this cultural shift. But we're also seeing now the expectations of people and of staff and the type of place they want to work. They just won't accept poor behaviours anymore.
There's some great data and some good news within that. I expect that there's carrot and stick. There's the incentive of running a great company for, as you say, long-term shareholder value. And then there's the stick of being caught doing the wrong thing. Do you think we're getting better with time, with the spotlight now firmly on these issues?
Yeah, you're spot on about the carrot and stick, and there's a lot of that to compliance. And I'll actually touch on that directly. But I would say in the 10 years that I've run Safetrac, I've witnessed massive change in this area. When I started to work in compliance 10 years ago, no one really knew what I was doing. Right. People really didn't know what compliance was, let alone why I would want to do it. And 10 years ago, we would work with a person who worked in a company that was often shoved in the bowels of an organisation. They were called a compliance officer. They had no budget. People in the organisation barely knew that person's name. They were usually the butt of most jokes in an organisation. And they would make suggestions on the way that the organisation should operate, but no one would listen to them. We're now seeing move from that to 10 years on, and we're seeing the formation of very large compliance and risk departments, chief officers often sitting on the board. They have significant budgets, and often they report upon initiatives, risks and controls, and that we will see those at the front and centre of many board reports. So that's a really, really large shift. We're also seeing there is a dearth of people that can work in these areas that have the experience to work in corporate compliance. And it's one of the most increasing roles that are advertised at the moment. So we are witnessing a really big growth there. And I really do believe that some organisations are getting it, really getting it. And interestingly, I don't think it's the fear of penalties that's now driving that change. I think it's more been the fear of bad media and brand damage that has driven many organisations to really take a look at how they're operating, and that check-a-box approach isn't really working. We've seen compliance breaches land companies on the front page of the papers for all the wrong reasons far too regularly. In the past few years, we've seen AML breaches, we've seen staff underpayments, we've seen health and safety, we've seen bullying, we've seen sexual harassment. The list is long and it seems to be growing. And really, you mentioned that carrot and stick approach, and we see that a lot in compliance. And whether it's a penalty for breach of legislation or brand damage, it is definitely that stick that is driving the change. And really, as long as our leaders don't embrace culture and a staff-first approach as part of their core mission, they're really missing the bigger picture. And for that reason, I think a lot of organisations really have a long way to go. As long as we've got large schools of old school management and leadership teams, they're going to need to be replaced before we see true and real change.
Right. So we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. Can you take me through some of the main recommendations from the Respect at Work report and what they mean for Australian businesses?
Yes, certainly. So there was 55 recommendations accepted in principle in the Roadmap to Respect report, and the positive measures will extend the timeline for making a sexual harassment complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission from 6 to 24 months. Importantly, we have clarified that sexual harassment is a form of serious misconduct that can warrant immediate dismissal. And we have closed the loophole that exempted parliamentarians and judges from being held accountable for sexual harassment complaints under the Sex Discrimination Act. Now, in relation to that second point, I think that's really very major, because that will mean that we're proven there is no longer an obligation to pay notice or pay notice in lieu under the National Employment Standards where there are findings of sexual harassment and where they've been substantiated. Now, the maximum payout of notice under the NES is 5 weeks, but the real cost issue here for companies is senior executives. When senior executives are on contracts with notice periods that can be 6 to 12 months or even the term of their appointment, where they, without this clarification, they were having to pay out these periods as sexual harassment wasn't necessarily disclosed as being serious misconduct. So having that clarity about sexual harassment is going to be sufficient to constitute that sort of conduct is serious misconduct under the law and warrants immediate dismissal. Now, whilst these recommendations are really helpful, I think what we were hoping for is that there would be a positive obligation placed onto workforces to prevent sexual harassment. That hasn't happened, but I believe that the government argues that duty already arises under the existing work health and safety laws. And the way that I look at the work health and safety laws, I certainly do believe there is actually already an obligation on workplaces to prevent this sort of behaviour. A safe workplace is not one which condones sexual harassment. So therefore, the duty is on an organisation already to ensure they are doing everything they can to prevent it.
Stay with me, Deborah. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Deborah Coram, CEO of compliance platform Safetrac. One of the, conflicts can become where a company's responsibilities don't align with normal cultural responsibilities, and sometimes that can lead to some confusion. Where is the balance between personal responsibility, that is an individual knowing that what they're doing is wrong, and the company's responsibility to create a safe workplace?
Look, interestingly, in Kate Jenkins' report, she found that sexual harassment was not inevitable. It is fully preventable. And we are all part of that solution, both individuals and companies. It is not okay for an individual to sexually assault someone or sexually harass someone, whether they are in or out of the workplace. But it is a workplace's responsibility to ensure that anybody working there is safe. And therefore, it is their responsibility to put in place a leadership team, a culture, policies, procedures, training, and to hire carefully and remove anyone who looks to breach that culture and safe environment. And this then comes down to how companies act after complaints have been made. And so often we've seen people brave enough to bring formal legal complaints of harassment are frequently asked to sign confidentiality agreement in settlement of their case. And these agreements usually prevent them from speaking about what they've experienced and means that conduct continues in the organisation unabated. And these agreements often reflect the imbalance at play, where the sexual harasser insists upon confidentiality and prevents others from knowing about which workplaces have sexual harassment problems. Now, there are a growing number of US jurisdictions, interestingly, which are introducing legislation that only permits these confidentiality clauses in sexual harassment settlements when the person who's been harassed requests it. Now, I'd like to see this sort of legislation adopted in Australia. And I think when we talk about how companies to act and how people can be responsible, I'd like to see companies acting in a way that doesn't push this sort of conduct under the carpet, but rather than deals with it, addresses it, and focuses on a victim-first approach and what's the best thing for them, not what is the best thing for the company and for the harasser.
Oh, it's a great answer. Would you say it's true to express it such as that it's everyone's responsibility to prevent harassment, and on top of that, the company has a responsibility because they're the reason that people are gathering in a certain place? The company has a great collective responsibility to make sure it's safe.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And I think that one of the problems that we face here is that companies have a reputation to protect. And we have a whole swathe of other laws that they need to follow around privacy, confidentiality, defamation. And if somebody accuses somebody of something, if we're to act on that without it actually being proven, the company can risk being in breach of other laws. So there is a real nexus of legislation at play in relation to how a company operates that sometimes we forget. And sometimes we use those in an imbalanced way to overpower the rights of a victim. And I think we need to choose to use those in a more empowering way. And I think that prevention is always better than cure. And we need to adopt practices that prevent these practices from ever occurring in the workplace. And there is a real focus on training and then enforcement of those standards within an organisation from the top right down to the bottom across an organisation. So even within the organisation, we all have individual accountability and responsibility.
And right from the induction of a new person into a company, and I mentioned two examples in AMP Capital and QBE where the CEOs were the ones involved, how important is it to set that model, the right culture at the top?
Look, absolutely critical. The reality is that culture stems from the top. I've said several things today that emphasise that, but there is a saying in compliance circles that I now seem to spruik almost on a daily basis, that the tone of the top sets the mood in the middle, which creates the buzz at the bottom. The reality is the culture of the organisation starts at the top. Leaders need to drive positive behaviour, managers need to model it, staff get to live it. And you can't have staff implementing culture, because if it's not followed through by management and through to the leadership, it's just not going to work. And we tend to see the most successful compliance programs driven by the board and the CEO. So some of the companies that we see that have amazing cultures have their compliance programs rolled out by the CEO or the chair or both, with them expressing how important these things are to the core of the organisation. Now, that's a very different message to someone going, oh, here, do some training. So how we deliver what we do and how much we tie it to our culture and the way we operate is critical. And there's no point training staff on a topic and checking a box if the board doesn't understand or care about it. Because if issues are brought to their attention, they're not prioritised or addressed. And we have seen repeatedly over the past 12 months, massive breaches in AML leading to large leadership and corporate failure, where boards were not trained in these topics. They didn't even understand them. So if these sort of cultures aren't being driven from the top down to the bottom, you can't expect them to resonate at a board level.
So just from that board perspective, one of the main differences between the two examples mentioned earlier, AMP Capital and QBE, AMP Capital seemed to go slowly and almost needed to be dragged along, while QBE made a change, it seemingly quite quickly as soon as they'd seen the external report. How much of that do you think is board determined? How much of that cultural shift comes from the board?
Again, I'm not closely involved in either of those companies. I mean, we could certainly see the way they behaved. AMP continued to make poor headlines, whereas QBE coverage focused on the individual at the centre of the scandal. And it was probably a pretty good indication that having a board that sees beyond short-term commercial decisions can result in long-term reputation protection. And without being directly involved in the hiring decisions at AMP, but I believe decisions were probably made at AMP knowing the individual involved and some of the claims that already existed, and they decided to hire that person anyway. That's a very odd decision for a board to make, and one that has had very, very serious repercussions for the organisation. And again, I talk about old school leadership, but once upon a time people went, a little bit of sexual harassment, not to worry, that's been going on for years. He's a good manager, let's get on with the show. That sort of pushing things under the carpet cannot continue in corporate Australia any longer. And if these people are on our boards, they are a serious liability to our organisation.
We'll be back with more in a moment. I'm talking to the Chief Executive Officer of Safetrac, Deborah Coram. Deborah, let's say we have a willing board, a willing CEO, and they engage Safetrac and wanting to attain higher performance through a better culture. How would Safetrac engage with that company in an ideal sense? Like, what's your ideal client?
Yeah, our ideal client is where the leadership team is on board and the program that will be rolled out under a leadership banner with the direct support of the board and or CEO. that there is a training program, that there are policies that support that training, that there is clear guidelines as to what an individual can do if they see breaches of the type of behaviours they're being trained about, that they're working in an organisation where there is no recrimination for coming forward with issues. We want to see an organisation who wants issues to be brought to light so that they can be addressed. And we want the training to be based around not our blueprint that we create, which will say, well, you need to train in a minimum of these things, but we want to customise that content to be about your organisation. How are you implementing these practices in your organisation, and how does that work at your organisation? So not just a check-a-box training that's here's what the AML legislation says, or here's what sexual harassment says. It's what does sexual harassment look like in our workplace, or more like what is sexual harassment and how does that not work in our workplace? What is and isn't sexual harassment? What is and isn't okay? And if you're feeling unsafe or unsure, here are the places that you can go to seek support or some type of remedy. So you're not really just talking about rolling out a program, you're really talking about support systems behind that support that training initiative.
Look, you were previously a lawyer at Minter Ellison. Does it ever surprise you how vulnerable organisations are making themselves by not having better culture in place?
Nothing surprises me at this point.
Right.
But it's mind-blowing at this point in time that the level of organisations that still come to us, and I'm talking top 100 corporations in Australia, come to us with barely a training program in place. It is astounding to me that we're still talking rudimentaries with some very large organisations. And I think that probably stems again from old school leadership. You know, we've still got leaders based from really another generation running a lot of these organisations. I mean, having come from a law firm's one of them. They're an interesting entity on themselves where you've got an atmosphere of unrealistic client demand combined essentially with greed and a desire to build the maximum amount of hours, where you've got very tight deadlines set by courts, royal commissions, corporate entities. You saw during the Financial Royal Commission some of these firms working 24-hour cycles, 15-hour shifts, 7 days a week. That's an environment that's completely intolerant of human frailties and mistakes. And, you know, they're expecting junior lawyers to work insane amounts of hours as well as their senior lawyers. Now, that is not a safe work environment. And indeed, that saw several firms investigated for breaches of the workplace health and safety laws, and big firms. And the statistics around mental health in the legal profession are absolutely alarming. You've got something like 11% of lawyers contemplating suicide on a monthly basis.
My God.
Yeah, 50% of law students and 33% of solicitors, 20% of barristers report they have experienced depression. Now, how is this a safe workplace culture? So, you know, again, you're talking very large volumes of institutions, of law firms, and anything that's in sort of that professional services area. That is the way they have been driven to operate for years. It doesn't surprise me because so many of these organisations have been formed around cultures and practices over many, many years. You know, the billable hour for law firms is what has driven that culture. But can they continue to operate in that way? No, they can't. So, you know, we're looking at these sort of organisations. I think it was Claus Chambers Westgarth who have come out and said they're doing away with the billable hour. You know, I've got my niece is a summer clerk and she's going to these firms and some of them are saying to her she's not allowed to work more than 7.5 hours a day. That's a very big change from when I was there, and basically you had to work 18 hours a day to look at moving up in the firm. So I believe that the change is coming and that a lot of these institutional organisations are really looking at how they can change and how they can do better. Again, probably driven more by stick than carrot, but change is definitely happening.
They both work, right?
Well, they do, yeah. And I think those that do use that carrot, it's a nicer way to make change, right?
Absolutely. I think we'd all favour it over the stick, but it seems that it takes both to make real change work.
I think that's right. It really does.
From what you've seen, what do you make of the culture within Parliament House? What needs to be done to change that?
The culture of Parliament House is completely representative of old school patriarchal domination, where they've been actively excluded from being held accountable in relation to sexual harassment claims. Like, that is pretty mind-blowing, isn't it? So some of the change that's coming there is desperately outdated and needed. But really, again, we need to look at our leaders. Who are we voting in? Are we just voting in the same old people? Are we voting in parliamentarians that are committed to change? And I struggle to believe that many of the people in Parliament House are the right leaders to make change. They have presided over archaic systems, and they've really been driven to action only by the incredibly brave actions of one particular young woman, Brittany Higgins. And had she chosen to stay silent, none of these changes would be happening. And again, you could say, had Grace Tame chosen to keep her silence rather than continue to pressure the PM to make change, maybe these changes wouldn't actually be happening. Maybe Brittany wouldn't have had the voice and the platform she has. So to be perfectly honest, I'm sceptical that the leaders we have in place are really the type of leaders that are committed to cultural change. And again, they are being driven very much by that stick of the media than actually actively seeking to make change voluntarily. I see them making changes because of the heat, and the pressure to do has become so intense, they can't possibly not make change. Look, it's evident there is a lot more to be done, but at a minimum, we really need all Australians, not just parliamentarians, regardless and irrespective of our industry. Everyone needs to be trained in respectful workplace behaviour. And if we can go about that as a minimum, then we can start to look at dictating long-term change and not just check-a-box activities, which enables us to say we've done this but doesn't actually create change.
Deborah, thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed this morning.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
That was Deborah Coram, CEO of compliance platform Safetrac, for the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. And join Sean Aylmer every weekday morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast, the business news you need for a successful day. I'm Adam Lang. Enjoy your day.